For most people, buying a cask of whiskey is a once-in-a-lifetime purchase, and while casks can be a great investment, it's very easy to go wrong because of the amount of misinformation that's out there. So I thought I'd make a video going through 15 of the most commonly asked questions that I get asked to try and set the record straight. So welcome to the channel. I'm Mark Littler. I'm a whiskey broker. I'm a Forbes contributor. I'm a Spears 500 whiskey advisor. I set up the website Protect Your Cask, and Protect Your Cask, including myself, have been praised in the Scottish Parliament for help protecting you, people who are out there trying to buy these casks as an investment. So let's just jump straight into this list. But before I do, each one of these questions that I answer could be a whole video in its own right. And I'm going to try and keep these answers succinct so that you get the most value in the shortest amount of time, but maybe we'll look at expanding all of these questions into their own videos in the future. So question one, what is cask investment and how does it work? Well, the premise of whiskey cask investment is built upon the nature of the Scotch whisky industry. And the Scotch whisky industry is built upon the premise that older whiskey is better and can sell for more than younger whiskey. So no matter what core range of whiskey you look at, whether that's Macallan, Glenallachie, Springbank, Glenfarclas, anybody, there's 100% correlation between the price and the age. So the older the whiskey, the more expensive it is. To use Macallan as an example, their 12-year-old costs £70, their 18-year-old costs £375, and their 25-year-old costs £2,500. So there's this huge growth, this is exponential growth. So the premise of cask investment is that you take a cask at one point, often the cheapest point in its lifetime, right down when it's young, and then you sell it when it's an old cask of whiskey, which means that you're investing time, which brings us neatly into who is cask investment suitable for. It is only suitable, there's no shortcuts, absolutely no shortcuts for cask investment. You have to be able to hold it for 10 to 20 years as a minimum. As a minimum. I've not known many people do it in less than 15 years. So you have to have that time horizon. If you're slightly older in life and you're looking at this and thinking this might be something suitable for your pensions, you're wrong. It's categorically not. It's suitable for buying. The best way to look at it is if you've got a child or grandchild. They've been born. You can buy them a cask of whiskey. When they turn 18, you can transfer the cask into their name. Obviously, you can't be in their name until they turn 18 for licensing laws in this UK. But when it's 18, not only will they be mature, but the whiskey will also be mature. So the only people that cask investment is suitable for is people who are very, very, very patient with those long-term horizons. Question number 3 then, how much does a cask of whiskey cost for investment purposes? Well, this is as long as a piece of string because everybody's situation is different and everybody's wealth is different. Losing £500 to one person might be the same as losing £500,000 to another person. But let's be realistic. Let's keep the risks as low as possible for everybody. And you want to try and get in on the cheapest possible way that you can. And there's a sweet spot really with casks. New make whiskey, you want to be looking at a price of around £2,000 to £2,500 for most brokers at the moment. And then for slightly older casks, 5 to 8 year old casks, your 5 to 10 year old casks in some cases are probably £4,000 to £6,000. If you go and buy directly from a distillery, those prices will be more. New make can be anywhere between £5,000 and £15,000. So there's a huge difference in price between buying on the secondary market from a broker or buying directly from distilleries. Both have their own pros and cons. And again, maybe this is something that we should look at in another video. And get in the comments below if you want me to answer any of your questions, because I'll probably be able to jump in the comments and answer them as these comments come in. Next question, what is the best age to buy a cask of whiskey for investment purposes? This kind of comes back to our previous question in terms of your horizons. And there's a difference between price and cost. Price is the monetary exchange that's going to happen for you to receive that cask of whiskey. Cost is something that can be measured in time. Buying new make is the best age to buy it if you want to pay the lowest price because the younger the whiskey, 0-year-old whiskey, it's not even whiskey, it's new make, it's just a spirit. It doesn't turn whiskey until 3 years in that cask in a bonded warehouse in Scotland. It's the cheapest entry point. It'll be about £2,000 to £2,500 for a cask. But the cost is 18 years. You've got to wait 18 years to get to that sweet spot where it starts getting premium. As we mentioned with that Macallan, there's a difference between of £70 for the first 12 years. 0 to 12, it costs £70 that bottle. 12 years to 18-year-olds, so half that time, it goes up nearly 4 times. It goes from £70 to £375. That is why you've got to get that cask to 18 to hit those sweet spots. So if you can afford to spend 18 years of your life waiting for that cask to mature, maybe you've just had a child or a grandchild, perfect. Then a new make cask is best for you. If you want to wait a shorter amount of time, buy a 5 to 6, 5 to 8-year-old cask, because if you buy a 6-year-old cask, the cost will be higher. As we've mentioned, it might be £5,000-7,000, somewhere in that region. But the cost will be less in terms of time, because obviously a 6-year-old cask only needs 12 years to get to 18. Now, categorically, I am not saying that you should buy a 15-year-old cask and hold it for 3 years and get it to 18. Just doesn't happen. You should only buy those 2 categories of casks if you're a normal person wanting to make a normal investment. Because this leads into our next question. Are cask investment returns guaranteed? Categorically not. Whisky casks are not regulated by the FCA or any sort of financial, like any financial authority, except in the USA, where they are. They're classed as a security in the USA, but again, that could be classed as the whole of a video. But maybe we should do that in the future. But are the cask investment returns guaranteed? Categorically not. You could lose everything. Look what's happened recently in the world. We had the war with Ukraine, and we've covered this in another video. We've had the war start in Ukraine. When the war started in Ukraine, there is a spiral of inflation, and that spiral of inflation caused banks around the world to put up their interest rates. The hike in interest rates has 100% correlation in the decline of the whiskey market and the decline of pretty much every market, the art market, the watch market, the jewelry market. Look at your local supermarket. Shrinkflation is happening everywhere. But especially if you look at Diageo have had a catastrophic fall from grace over a very long period of time, but it all began at that point that the interest rates came in. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is that you might have bought a cask at a market peak in 2022, and now you're selling it in a market trough in 2025. It's not guaranteed. You have to be able to ride out these waves and these glitches in the market, which is why, again, you need to invest a lot of time. And over the long term, from the history of Scotch whisky, there's always been a huge 100% correlation between a young cask or a young bottle of whisky costing a smaller amount than a very old bottle of whisky. So the returns are not guaranteed, but unless something dramatic happens with the shake-up of Scotch whisky, where older whisky is worth more or worth less than younger whisky, then the model itself, we come back to that first question, the model itself of the premise of cask investment is relatively sound. Is the profit from selling a cask of whisky tax-free in the UK? Now, again, I'm not a financial advisor, but I'm a broker. I help people exit their cask investments. We've helped them exit them for nearly 10 years now, actually. We've helped people sell casks of Springbank and Macallan. The most expensive cask that we've ever someone sell was over £1.2 million. Casks of Springbank that people were buying 20, 30 years ago are now regularly worth 50, 100, £200,000. So when they put that money in the bank, they've sought their own financial advice. And what they've reported back to me is that casks of whisky are free of capital gains tax because they are a wasting asset. They're a wasting asset because of the predictable lifespan of less than 50 years. And if you look on Whisky Base, of all the 260,000 bottles that are listed on there, less than a fraction of 1% of those bottles have ever made it 50 years and above. So the predictable lifespan with a 99% degree of accuracy is that they will not last 50 years and therefore are seen as capital gains exempt in cask. However, as soon as you go into bottle, completely different picture. Again, another caveat here, and this is the biggest one. Look at the budgets. Look what's happening. I don't think that capital gains tax will be announced in the next budget on whiskey casks, but you know what? It wouldn't surprise me if it was, because it's an easy win for people, because it's probably one of the only investments at the moment that is free of capital gains tax. Next question. What are the hidden costs of holding a cask of whiskey? Well, there's not many hidden costs, really. The obvious costs that you need to be aware of are insurance and rent. Insurance. If you've got an expensive old cask of whiskey, it might be worth taking out. With insurance, it will cost you, with a private policy, about £300 for about £100,000 worth of cover. So it's a very small price for a very high amount of cover. Why is that? Because the policies often do not cover almost anything. They will not cover evaporation. They will not cover leaks. That's just inherent vice in a cask of whiskey. So you can't insure against evaporation or losses. You can insure against a forklift driver driving into it and smashing the cask, but also at the same time, again, I'm not an insurance broker, but from what I understand is that warehouse will also have its own insurance policy in place to cover such events, because that's how insurance works. That's how, if you're storing things for people, that's how it all works. So insurance is one. You definitely don't need it, in my opinion. But the other cost is the cost of storage and other sundry costs. So storage, depending on the warehouse, can be anywhere between £30-40 a year up to £150-200 a year at the moment. It's not cheap. You're storing it. Look at a cask of whiskey. A hogshead is about 2 cubic meters worth of space in a warehouse. It's not going to be cheap. The other costs that you need to be aware of are re-gauging, which is where you measure how much whiskey is inside the cask, and samples, of course. Drawing a sample out of a cask of whiskey, it might look romantic when you see it on the distillery and they're just siphoning a bit off, but look at the practical terms. If you're in a warehouse, you've got to get that cask off the rack, down on the floor, draw the whiskey out, record it all, get all the duty sorted, do all the administration and post it out to you, and then put the cask back up on the rack. So drawing a sample might cost you up to £100 for one sample. Most distilleries that we work with now are charging, like big distilleries, they're charging around £70 just for a single sample. Anyway, next question. How do I get an accurate valuation for my whiskey cask? Well, you don't. There isn't really much way of getting an accurate valuation for a whiskey cask, and this is why there's so much fraud out there. It's an opaque and non-transparent market. As I've said, a young cask of whiskey should cost you £4,000 to £6,000, £4,000 to £7,000 for something 5 to 8 years old. A new make cask of whiskey will probably cost you £2,000-2,500. If you're buying on the secondary market, it'll be more if you're buying from a whiskey broker, from a whiskey distillery direct, because they add their own margins and things into it. The best way to try and, well, what's the essence of this question? Why are you getting a valuation? If you're getting a valuation in that interim term between purchase price and sale, it's meaningless. You're not selling it, so it doesn't matter. It only becomes meaningful when you're trying to sell it. At that point, you're then looking at the value of that cask on the value on the secondary market. And on the secondary market, we mean selling to independent bottlers and not to other investors. Selling to other investors is essentially pyramid selling, because there's a conflict of interest. Who are you representing as a broker? Are you representing the buyer, trying to get it for them for the cheapest price, or are you representing the seller, trying to get them the highest price? They aren't mutually compatible as a business model unless you're pyramid selling. So the only way to sell a cask is to sell it to an independent bottler when it becomes a commercial decision. And then a business can make a commercial decision as to whether that is a good cask for them and whether they can make profit from it, rather than an investment decision. Now, the accurate valuation depends on the time frame, because if you bought a cask of whiskey, as we said, in 2022, it's likely lost value because the market has softened. If you bought a cask of whiskey in 2020, it's probably gained value, because not only have you put a decent amount of age into it now, but the market, you've lost that peak and you're now back down in a trough. But we come back to that further point. It doesn't matter. Are you 20 years into your cask investment? Well, in that point, if you bought it in 2005, you're probably still in for a good profit, because you've ridden out and you've seen so much growth on it. So getting an accurate valuation is very difficult for any cask of whiskey. What documentation proves that you own the cask? Well, there's a number. There's the hypothetical bullshit ones, and then there's the only ones that matter. The hypothetical ones that would work in a court of law, but by the time you've got to a court of law, you're probably getting into quite a few other problems and you're thinking, what the hell is going on here? But essentially your invoice and contract will work to prove that you purchased that cask. Yes, that shows that you purchased it, but it doesn't prove that you own it. The ownership, and I would class ownership as autonomy. If you go to a jeweler's and you buy a watch, if you handed them over money and you got an invoice and a receipt for that, you've got proof that you've handed over money for that watch. What if that watch didn't even exist? And that is exactly what can happen if you buy a cask without a delivery order. The delivery order is what transfers the cask from the seller to the buyer. And obviously, you don't really need an invoice and a contract to prove anything to anybody if the cask is held in your name, because of course to get it in your name there's obviously going to be a trail of paperwork that essentially got it into your name, unless somebody's going around there and randomly sending casks out to people in the post and it's like, what, sending the, like you just wouldn't transfer the ownership without that paper trail. So don't, certificates meaningless, invoice, yeah, some use. Contract, yeah, some use. Delivery order, that is the only piece of paperwork that you should be insisting on. Without a delivery order, turn around, walk completely away from the sale. So next question then, what are the key scams and red flags to watch out for? Well, key scams is simple. Price manipulation, but that's pretty difficult for you to watch out for because, as we've just mentioned, getting evaluations almost impossible. So what are the key scams? Price manipulation? Anyway, recently I saw, anyway, why do I say that? There's almost no bottle fraud in the whiskey industry compared to the wine industry. The wine industry has been historically plagued by people like Rudy, I can't pronounce his surname. Anyway, producing huge numbers of fake bottles, essentially changing the labels, changing the capsules and corks and the wine inside, and faking wine. That is how wine fraud has always worked. With whiskey fraud, and this goes all the way back to an SEC warning that came out from the Securities and Exchange Commission in the USA 50 years ago, the whiskey fraud that was happening then, and it's still happening now, is price manipulation. So I was recently contacted by somebody who had a Glenrothes, about 10, 11-year-old, a sherry butt, and he'd paid £45,000 for it. I know a lady recently whose husband or widow, her husband, who's now unfortunately died, spent £750,000 on a cask of Macallan that's worth less than £200,000. That is where the fraud comes in. And this is why we come back to that earlier question, how much should you invest? Well, you go in at the lowest possible price, £2,500 for your new make, £4,000 to £6,000 for those younger casks. Therefore, you can't lose tens of thousands of pounds because you've not handed over tens of thousands of pounds in the first instance. Red flags, though, are heavy sales tactics, no delivery orders, and phone calls out the blue to say, oh, your cask has gone up in value, do you want to buy another one? And then they'll ladder you, because every scam that I've seen has been taking one cask of whiskey, like purchase, and then they'll sell another and sell another and sell another. And every time the exposure and the risk gets greater. Anyway, yeah, no delivery orders. Without a delivery order, definitely don't buy. That is one of the biggest red flags. Should I invest in ex-sherry or ex-bourbon casks is the next commonly asked question that I get. And to be honest with you, I don't think there's any problem in buying either of them. The one thing that I would say to avoid is buying wine casks, because how many wine casks have you seen on the market? There's not that many. The reason why there's not that many is because it's not a tested formula. There isn't actually that many on the market because buying ex-wine casks is pretty risky, and bottling wine casks is pretty risky. Look at Whiskey Fun. Serge, Angus, they hate, broadly speaking, wine for your finished casks. The industry's been using sherry casks for the best part of, well over 100 years, and it's been using ex-bourbon casks for probably a much shorter period of time, probably around 50 years or so, but both of them are very well tried and tested. So all I would say is, should you invest in ex-sherry or bourbon, either just don't buy anything else. Don't buy rum, don't buy wine, don't buy tequila, none of that nonsense, just sherry or bourbon. Which distilleries offer the best investment potential? The distilleries that offer the best investment potential are ones that have got space to grow within marketing. Whiskey is just marketing, people. That's all it is. The most expensive whiskies in the world are not the best whiskies. It's the ones that are being marketed the best. The most expensive ones are always the ones that are marketed the best. So the only way to do that, and I would discount pretty much every new distillery, and I'd class a new distillery as being under 20, 30 years old, they can never become a sensational investment. Even if you went and bought a cask of Arran, phenomenally good whiskey, back in the 1990s when the distillery first opened, there's a limit to how much that whiskey can sell for because that cap is set by the distillery itself. Therefore, if you've got a 25-year-old whiskey, well, Arran's 25-year-old whiskey, it's sub £500. Macallan's 25-year-old whiskey, because is Macallan's 25 better than the Arran's 25? That's a very difficult one to weigh up, but blind tasted, there'd be very little in it for most people. But Macallan can charge more because they've got a higher market position and they have many of these aspirational halo products of very, very old bottlings, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. The 80-year-old whiskies are all there that drag up the appearance and market position of those other bottles. So the distilleries that offer the best investment potential are the ones that haven't been heavily remarketed, they're not brand new, and they are both old and have potential to be changed by a marketing team. End of. What's angel share and how does it affect value? Essentially, a cask of whiskey is not a sealed vessel. It is a breathing, living vessel. And every year in Scotland, the average evaporation loss is around 2% for most of the lifetime of the cask, but it can be as up to 5 to 10% in the first couple of years of a cask's life. Obviously, that means that your investment is being evaporated year after year. So the more age that goes into the cask, the less whiskey that you tend to have in there. So you really need to monitor the angel share, and that is done with a regauge. Finally, how do I sell my cask when I want to exit the investment? Well, it's not when you want to exit the investment, but it's when the investment is ready to exit. Because if you want to try and exit it early, if you bought a 5-year-old cask and you wanted to try and sell it as a 10-year-old cask, broadly speaking, you're stuck. There's not an easy way to do that. The only way to do it without pyramid selling or going through a pyramid selling company would be to put it into auction. But buying a cask of whiskey, as we said, look at all these questions that we've been talking about for nearly 25 minutes. It's not easy to do on that basis. The only way to exit it really is through an independent bottler. And then the way that you can do that is two ways. You can contact a broker such as myself. That's what I do. That's my day job. Or you can try and do it yourself. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you trying to do it yourself. But the idea that casks are an easy exit or an easy sell on exit is a myth. That just isn't the case. Even if you came to me today with a Macallan or a Springbank, it's a tricky market out there today. In previous years, it was much easier. But buying a cask and selling it is not something that should be gone into lightly. Both of them can yield great profits. Buying a cask at a young age and holding it until it's an old cask of whiskey and letting time do its thing, letting the markets do its thing, has historically always been a very good investment. As long as you pay attention to all of these questions that we've gone through earlier. But anybody who's telling you that you can do it in a short period of time or it's the next greatest thing is straight out lying to you. So there we go. I think we hit 13 questions, but I think we may as well wrap this video up now. It's been going on long enough. But any other questions, do get in the comments and let me know.